let me introduce our guest, Adolph Reed, a real thorn in the side of neoliberals, I would say. He's professor emeritus at Penn, the author of several books, including a book on Jesse Jackson called, remind me what it was called?
Jesse Jackson Phenomenon.
There you go.
26, yep.
He's also written about Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois and American political thought, Without Justice for All, The New Liberalism and Our Retreat from Racial Equality. He's also the founder of Non-Site, which is a peer-reviewed online journal. And yeah, you are always writing things that are getting the right people angry. And you have your latest piece is Non-Site, and you wrote that with Michael Ben.
Walter Ben Michaels, yeah.
Walter Ben Michaels, sorry about that. Walter Ben Michaels, and it's about the problem of the disparity discourse.
Right.
I'll take that up right now. So can you tell us what made you write that piece?
Sure. I mean, I've been writing somewhere between critical and reflective pieces about disparity discourse since 2012. My friend and colleague Merlin Chalkwanian and I, who's a public health professor at Columbia, did an article in 2012 in the Socialist Register called Race Class Crisis, and it was an examination of the limits of the discourse of racial disparity then. The main argument is, as we've refined it over the years, and Merlin and I think are technically working on a book on this, that disparity, that there are two basic metrics of justice or social justice. One of them is what political scientist Preston Smith calls the discourse of racial disparity, or the norm of racial disparity, which basically boils down to radically understood equality of opportunity. And according to that norm, the society would be just if, say, Black people, but other designated groups occupied different rungs of the social, political, and economic hierarchy in percentages that were roughly equivalent, más o menos, to their proportion in the general population, right? So that's the principle of racial democracy. The principle of social democracy focuses on overall inequality, right? And the gap between the rich and the capitalist class and everybody else. And in principle, either of them is a defensible norm of justice. And as a number of people argue, a lot of people arguing now, that they aren't mutually exclusive. And it's true, they are not logically mutually exclusive, but they aren't dependent on each other either, right? And in Black politics, for instance, as Preston Smith has argued and shown, from the mid-1930s to roughly like the end of the 1960s, Black politics was driven by, or was anchored to both norms, right? Both the norm of racial democracy and the norm of social democracy. And because they were so closely tied together practically, and by the way, one of the reasons that they were was that the people who were most likely to support racial democratic ideals were also leftists, right? So, and because they were seemed to coincide more than coexist for so long, it just became natural for people to think that they're basically like two versions of the same thing, but they aren't. And what we've argued, and what Merlin Chalkwanian and I have argued, and what I've argued, and what Walter's argued, is that increasingly over the last 40 to 50 years, what we see is that the ideal of racial democracy, which is what undergirds the focus on disparity as the main metric of inequality for concern, has preempted, displaced, eaten, pushed aside, murdered in the womb, the principle of social democracy, right? And what we have said repeatedly is that the fundamental problem with the racial democratic ideal is that it assumes whatever the hierarchical structure of the society is, and insists that blacks just be their appropriate percentage of the goods and bads, right? I mean, there was a Black Power minister in the late 1960s who argued actually that freedom would be when black people were 12% of everything, from the corporate boardrooms to the homeless. Well, and as the society has become steadily more unequal in the 40 years of neoliberalism, basically, the gap between the rich and the powerful and everybody else is growing steadily. So, in fact, one of the points we make in the non-side piece is that the racial wealth gap ultimately pales in comparison to the class gap, right? That is the difference in the percentage of national wealth and income that's owned by the top 1% of the population, or even top 1/10 of 1% of the population, and all of the rest of us. So, I mean, that's and what we do in the non-side piece is we take a sort of cold, sober eye to three of the domains in which disparities discourse is most prominent currently. And one which I'd written about before, again with Merlin, actually, in a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as the Common Dreams essay, is the mischief, the potential for mischief that a focus on the racial disparity as an explanation for even what is apparently the case, that blacks are more vulnerable to serious illness and death from COVID-19 than the general population. That not going beyond the focus on racial disparity doesn't help us understand the causation, doesn't help us figure out what to do about it, and worst of all, can feed into the toxic cesspool of racial medicine that's always lying beneath the surface, like in the medical field. I mean, basically. So we look at that. We look at the wealth gap, and we examine the racial disparities in police killings. So, I mean, that's what we do. Like, we decided to take the ball straight to the basket, because I know you're an avid sports fan,
yeah.
Even a sports writer.
There you go. NFL coming back. Matt Taibbi told me today.
Here. And I mean, just to lay the argument out there in as tight and as clear a way as we possibly can, because there's, you've been around the left, right? And there's a lot of Twitter argument, which means like no argument, right? It's like you turn what someone says into what you would prefer for them to have said to make it easier for you to attack them, and then you attack that, right? And
right.
And the Sweet Brown one said, "Ain't nobody got time for that," right? I mean, so, but so like we wanted to make the coherent statement and to put something out there to make the position clear. And frankly, I'm getting kind of tired of being attacked for what I'm not arguing, just because it makes people feel better about themselves.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the thesis, right? I mean, well, you go through all this, you actually do the work and show the work. But I think that one of the interesting issues is that there's kind of like a collapsing of moral and strategic arguments out there, not with you, but the way that people bring this up is it's kind of like, the disparity or the disproportionate argument, right? They're related. They're not the same thing, but they're related, and they're both. In both cases, it's a question of just like you said, 12% in every sector, right? So you have a more egalitarian representation of people. You have like a rainbow of oppressed and a rainbow of rich.
Right.
A rainbow 1%, a rainbow 99%.
Right.
And what's interesting though is that, I mean, as you say in this piece, that it's not racism is not the real cause, and anti-racism is not the real solution to this to these symptoms. So can you talk more about that? Why people think racism is the problem, and how it actually works? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think people think that racism is a causal explanation because people think that racism is the causal explanation, right? It's because you hear it all the time, and it's like a pietistic thing, right? That if you don't, genuflect, right? Well, I guess you don't genuflect before sin, but if you don't acknowledge the sin, then you're an insensitive person, you're a bad person, right? Whatever.
Class reductionist.
Yeah, right. Oh, yes, that's what you would be. And the funny thing about that is, that this notion, well, I tell you, like, I was just communicating with a grad advisory of mine about an hour ago, and I remember that when she was a first-year student or first-year student, she took my Black American Political Thought course, and she led class discussion around a welter of readings from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. And she observed somewhat ingenuously that the one thing that she noticed about these people, and it's like, A. Philip Randolph, Ralph Bunche, Lester Granger from the Urban League, John P. Davis from the National Negro Congress, a bunch of other people, academics, Oliver Cox, and the rest. But she said the first thing she noticed was that none of them talked about fighting racism, right? Like they all were focused on fighting for specific policies and programs and against other specific policies and programs. But like nobody was saddling up to go to war against an abstraction called racism. And which I thought was quite perceptive. And I'd mentioned once a few years ago, like in an earlier piece about this, that the war against racism is like the war against terrorism, like it's an abstraction, right? So you can never say when you've won because you don't define the enemy. And worse, racism, as it's been understood in the U.S. since across most of the post-war era, as like the original sin or the national disease, right, or whatever. That kind of metaphor is an ahistorical phenomenon, right? So, and it's an abstraction, right? It supposedly lives within people. If you listen to people like Ibram Kendi or Frank Wilderson, like you can't purge it, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, you can only atone in public, which is something Protestants really like to do anyway.
And of course, the great Robin DiAngelo.
Indeed.
Fragility, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, that well, all right. So first place, she's Italian, so she's like from the suburbs of Africa anyway. Right. So I'll give her a pass on that one, on being a white lady who makes out on anti-racism training. But yeah, so the reason that I say that racism isn't the cause of anything, right, is that, and that's not to say that racism doesn't exist and that people aren't racists and that institutionalized inequalities may not be in some way or aren't in some way connected with racist practices and attitudes, whatever. But what I mean is that racism itself doesn't explain how any particular inequality comes to exist, right? And if you want to, so it's not, as we say, as Walter and I say in the piece, racism as a diagnosis isn't an etiological one, right? Like it doesn't explain the cause or the sources of the inequality or injustice. It's a taxonomic diagnosis, by which I mean it tells us what how we should categorize the causal phenomenon. It doesn't tell us what it is, right? And since taxonomies don't exist in the real world, but are all ideational constructions, it's calling it racism doesn't explain, even like with respect to the obvious, whipping boys of the anti-racist line, redlining, right? So we know how redlining worked, right? And we know that one of the factors that propelled redlining as a practice was racist presumptions on the part of the real estate industry, and to some extent, the real estate industry, the mortgage industry, and to some extent, public officials, and also to some extent, white homeowners. So that's a good one. But I defy anybody to tell me or to explain to me how racism produces COVID death disparities, right? And you get like a narrative that goes back, to 1619 or to 1850 or to 1895 or to 1945, 1960, but from the standpoint of specific individuals who are working frontline jobs. Yes, it's certainly true that Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be concentrated in low-wage frontline jobs than whites, and that the reasons for that disproportionate concentration have partly to do with racist practices in the past, right? That doesn't really tell you much about how those people are concentrated in those jobs today, because racist practices in the past put them in a position in a comparatively weak labor market position. And you might say that there's discrimination. There probably is, to be sure. There's some degree of discrimination, but to say that racism explains why they are disproportionately in frontline, low-wage, precarious employment, overcrowded housing, show like the medical conditions that are associated with inadequate access to healthcare, doesn't really point us in a direction of trying to remedy any one of those conditions, right? So that takes me back to the point about taxonomy, that the racism diagnosis really is all about telling us the name that we should call the injustice by, right? I mean, not how we should address it. And that's one of the reasons that it makes sense, I believe, that people think that anti-racist politics is the response, because it makes sense. It's kind of like garbage in, right, garbage out. But how, for instance, and I know some people will object that this is a cheap shot, but how the Academy Awards decision to include, as it were, inclusion as a category for the best picture Oscar is supposed to speak to overcrowded housing like in East Harlem is beyond me. And it does amount to, and we said this too, that anti-racist remedies of the anti-disparitarian sort, right, often amount to a kind of racial version of a trickle-down policy, right? Like making more Black people rich and rich Black people richer is somehow supposed to make my life better, right?
Yeah, I think it would be one thing if people kind of owned that, if people were like, that's what we want to do. But most people equate that with some kind of, I guess it is a form of equality, although I wonder if most people, if you ask them point blank, if they would say that's what we want to fight for.
Well, people who imagine that they'll make the bank off of it definitely want to fight for it.
Right.
But yeah, look, Katie, I completely agree with you. I was just saying to somebody this morning that some of this stuff is like guild concerns, right? Like struggle for more black faculty or more, for more black faculty and more black doctors and stuff like that. And who can oppose it, right? I mean, nobody's opposed to that. But the problem is that those are fundamentally guild issues, and which means that they will benefit people who are in the guild, and not so much anybody else, right? And if people would just say that and be honest about it, then then we could deal with it, right?
Right. Save a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, totally. Yeah, but we even support it, right? I mean, my problem isn't that more black people aren't winning. No, I'm not opposed to the idea that more black people ought to win Oscars for all the shitty movies that get made, right? And frankly, I wouldn't care, right? It's like not an issue I'm concerned about, right? But more power to them as part of jockeying within the motion picture industry for a position. I mean, that's all right. I wish them luck even. But my problem is with the extent to which that guild and other narrow concerns are projected as the equivalent of a general egalitarian posture and program. And look at, I mean, I'm also like, we also take a little shot at the both Andis types toward the end of that piece, because, yeah, people say, well, that the two metrics of inequality aren't mutually of equality, let's say, aren't mutually exclusive. But the practical reality is, if you look at stuff like the response of the black chattering class and the political class to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and in 2020, and to Biden and the Wall Street stuff now, the fact of the matter is they may not necessarily be mutually exclusive, but everybody's talking about the one and nobody's talking about the other. And then beyond that, as we conclude the piece, it's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine how we could prevail on any of the redistributive programs and agendas that we need for working people of whatever race, creed, color, prior condition of servitude, sexual orientation, whatever, apart from building a broad, deep coalition among the majority of people in this country. And, like we always said during the Labor Party experience, like the most fundamental identity, right, in the United States, the most broadly shared and the most deeply consequential is the identity of somebody who's expected to go work for a living every day. And that just seems to me to be the base on which we start to construct the solidarity. And that's not to suggest that the differences aren't there. They obviously are. I mean, anybody who's ever spent any time around a union, except maybe the brother of the sleeping car porters, understands, right, the basis for tensions and butting heads over difference. But do you get farther by butting heads over difference from a foundation in a solidaristic understanding of shared interests, or do you get there by hectoring people about how they need to acknowledge their privilege, right, or atone for the sins of their grandparents or whatever? I mean, it just seems like bullshit, frankly.
Yeah. It's funny because, I mean, what always strikes me is that there are kind of two overlapping issues or related issues. One is like, and I'm guilty of this, I have to admit, because there is a lot of pressure to kind of virtue signal or not look like a class reductionist. So And I will say, I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to say sometimes like, I do care about white working class people as well. And I'm not like downplaying racism, but I do care about them. Right. So what I often find myself doing is saying, which is true, that even if you hate these people, and I kind of make this as a rhetorical argument, even if you hate these people, you have contempt for them. Like you're a lib who hates them. You think all white working class people who don't love, you know, who don't hate Trump, they all have one tooth among them, sleep with their sister, all those like offensive tropes. Like, don't you get that that there's power in numbers? Right. So you have to, it's like mind-boggling to me.
Well, that's the thing. And look, I appreciate the temptation to do a little of virtue signaling.
I'm just being honest about it. I mean, it's confessional.
Well, okay. Well, I'll give you absolution. But I mean, plus it's the, and I'm so broad-minded now, like I'll give you absolution for that Jesus thing too.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. I'll give you a mazel tov. Yeah.
Well, excellent work out. But because it's almost impossible to avoid being put on the spot about that, especially in our class and the world we operate in, and it says a lot. I mean, so right after,
like you get called self-loathing or some kind of sellout, and if I do it, I'm not. This is not a pity party for me, but it's like, you know, I'll be called racist. You're called a sellout or something worse, as if like you can't actually have politics or ideology that are different from Joanne Reed's.
No, right, exactly. Totally. And I mean, I'm not as much of a contrarian as some people like to think I am, but one thing I'm definitely contrarian about is, you know, I had 12 years of catechism, and I know what it looks like. I know what it smells like. I almost didn't graduate from high school because I failed my senior religion final out of protest. And I know
not Luther style of protest, right?
No. But well, I would say something funny about that, but I'd probably get like busted on for that too. But no, I just like we had one of the exam questions was what was on the virgin birth, and I just wrote an essay about how it was an impossibility. Yeah, it was a joke, right? Jerk that you do, almost drove the nun nuts. But I know what catechistic expectations are, and I'm just not going to do it. Right? I'm just not going to partake in it because it doesn't lead anywhere good. Right? I mean, it's one of the cars on that train that once you get on it, right, it might make some twists and turns and might make some small stops along the way. But where the train of that kind of irrationalist politics always winds up is Auschwitz. Yeah. Right. So, but anyway, I mean, where was I going? What were we talking about?
We were talking. Well, I brought up how I often find myself.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yes. And what I was going to say was like right after John Kerry lost. I was going to my first meeting of a committee of an academic association, and a colleague, a Harvard professor, in fact, whom I knew by reputation, but hadn't met personally, called me as soon as I got to the meeting and said that she had to talk to me about the election and what I thought happened. And she mentioned this 3 or 4 times over the course of the day. And we finally, on a break, had a glass of wine in the hotel bar. And the first thing I learned was that, as is so often the case when people say that they want to hear what you have to say, the reality was she wanted to tell me what she had to say.
Right.
And it was all about these busted, fucked up white people out there in the middle of nowhere who, like, you know, didn't do the right thing. And I'm yes-butting her, right? Like crazy. And I even resorted to my son's quip that, because he'd been living in central Illinois for 2.5 or 3 years at that point, that either Kerry talked about NAFTA or Bush was going to talk about gay marriage, right? that's how it played out. But she stopped me finally because she wasn't having any of it. Right? She wasn't having any modifications, and she finally said, "Well, face it, Adolph. Those people just aren't like us." So I said, "Oh yeah, well that's okay. That's what this whole game is." And this person was black, by the way, too.
Mm-hmm.
But with respect to like the white working class, and one thing that's really struck me since 2016 is how working class has become a racial category. Right. So you can't be black and working class, right? You got so I mean, working class means white, but the number that I keep tossing around is between 6.5 million and over 9 million people who voted for Trump in 2016 voted for Obama at least once. So maybe some of them, and like the drugstore shrinks will provide psychoanalytic or pop psychoanalytic explanations for it, right? They voted for Obama to show that they weren't racist, but then they couldn't stand it, and they voted for Trump, right? Because they couldn't stand it, right? But the possibility, right, that that they voted for Trump for the same false promises that led them to vote for Obama, just is something that people won't acknowledge. And there's a great essay that we published in Non-Site right after the 2016 election by a friend and colleague named Leslie Lopez at the University of Hawaii. And it's called, I forget the exact title, but I mean, people can find it. But it's about two Trump voters, right? And they were her parents, or two Latino Trump voters who were parents. Right? Her father's a union man. He worked with Chavez in the UFWC.
Cesar Chavez, just so people know.
Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry. And was a steward in a meatpacking local, and was an AFGE when he worked on a military base. Her mother's a social worker. And what her father said to her when she was hectoring him about it was, I believe Trump like I believed Obama. And, when you think about it, like there's a way, and I guess I should duck when I say this, right? Duck from the internet. There's a way that Obama kind of opened the door for Trump, right? Because Obama's line was never really that he was connected to any kind of progressive political agenda. He embodied a progressive political agenda because of his race and his personal story. And the personal story was what we were given to understand was going to help us overcome or counteract or mitigate the effects of the financial crisis and 40 or 30 years of neoliberalization. And it didn't do it, right? And so to the extent that the mystique of electing the first Black president was a false promise to take care of all this, then the Pied Piper of Bavaria comes along and says, yeah, well, race really is the embodiment of what'll make your life better. It's just not that version of it. Like it's this version of it. And a scary thing that I've heard from and granted it's all anecdotal, but from friends and even some family members who talked about in-laws or whatever, people who voted for Trump, it's kind of sheepish opportunism in 2016. It's like, yeah, I know he's an evil person, but my taxes and my money.
Right.
But I'm getting anecdotal reports now about people who were like that in 2016 who are now sucked in more and are recycling the QAnon stuff and the Pizzagate and all the rest of it. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense because these are what the ones I've heard about are by and large comparatively well-off people. But the Democrats haven't been offering working people anything, right? Except as the fellows used to say on the street corner here, when I was a kid, often only bubble gum in hard times, and they're always fresh out of bubble gum, right? I mean, that's what the Democrats have been doing since Jimmy Carter, right? And they don't have anything to offer, and eventually people are going to start to go for other stuff. I mean, that's one of the things that's so frustrating about this Biden thing. I mean, I think I said last time I was on with you and Matt that the Democrats made clear both in 2016, but especially in 2020, that they're more afraid of the left than they are of a second Trump term, right?
Yeah.
But Biden is what there is, and I think that my slogan, just to get the record straight about how I feel about it, is I would like to get a bumper sticker that says Biden Harris, because sometimes you just have to clean the damn toilet.
Yeah.
Because that's what this is like, I think, right? But that said, I think the greatest danger of 4 or 8 years of Biden or Biden Harris or whatever is that things are going to get worse and worse. They're definitely getting worse and worse after the pandemic. Even when we come out the other side, one of the things that coming out the other side is going to mean is seeing just how much worse things have gotten for people. The Democrats aren't going to offer anything, and that will set the stage for a more competent version of Trump, right? Mark Budzik, suggested maybe Nikki Haley, but even somebody more competent and saleable and ruthless than that. And I think another thing that leftists ought to stop doing, and I guess I'm just preaching now, is pretending that we have better options than we have, right? Lord knows, I've always thought that what you need to do in bad times is to try to imagine the absolute worst thing that can happen and figure out how you could try to deal with that, right, in the reaction. But all the, I can't vote for Biden, or just like I can't vote for Hillary 4 years ago, or who's the Greens?
Howie Hawkins.
Oh, right, that's right. I even forgot. I'm such a non-entity. Yeah. But the reality is that that's the thing that there is to do right now. It's not glamorous, but like I said, sometimes you just have to clean the toilet, right? And that's what this is, to try to create enough space to begin to organize into some kind of fight back.
Yeah.
I kind of rambled there, didn't I? No,
but I think that is what. It's funny you said Angela Davis, who, you are a Bernie person, so I don't understand how Angela Davis somehow thinks general elections matter, but primaries don't.
Right.
But she said, Biden creates more space for, of course, what she called anti-racism, anti-racist organizing. But the principle of leaving some space, but it's interesting because even when you just said that your worry is that Biden Harris will bring in another more competent, more airbrushed Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So is this just buying some years? In other words, if they're going to do that, that just gives us more time to try to
build the defenses on the edge of Stalingrad.
Yeah, right.
Right. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Right, to get ready for the bigger fight. And it's going to be a fight against them, too. That's the other thing about it. And one of the problems is that when the Democrats are in office, the leadership of our left of center, interest group organizations, spend so much time cleaning up after them. Right. And I was just looking at it. The first chapter of my long-suffering book that I just, the chapter that I just rewrote, and recalling that that when Obama was in office, the AFL-CIO, that's just one example that comes to mind. There are a lot of others. Publicly denounced the deficit commission that was threatening Social Security. And the denunciations were good, like the setting off the public alarms were good and important, but they went out of their way not to mention who appointed that commission, because it was Obama, right? And the Obama administration had tried to privatize sections of the Postal Service too, but you can't mention that now because like Trump's the demon who is responsible for everything. And if the Trump people hadn't decided like to go appeal to the ghosts of the SA, basically, then they could be doing that as well. I mean, they could be taking advantage of that as well, because so much of the stuff that the Democrats have cried distressed Pearl Pureheart about and clutched their pearls over was stuff that Obama had been doing as well. But yeah, no, the thing is, like, we just need, and I'm not even sure, and like this is when I get dispirited, but I'm not even sure that what we think of as the left here has the capacity, the will, the heart, the other directedness to try to do the hard organizing work that's got to be done to resist this. I mean, I'll say that this too. I might have mentioned this last time we were on, but my old friend and comrade Jane McAlevy's new book, No Shortcuts. I think she's got another one coming out, so it'll be the Not Quite So New book. Makes a big deal of a distinction between what she refers to as mobilizing and what she refers to as organizing. And mobilizing presumes that you have a constituency that's there, that you can basically reach with what used to be called a phone tree, right? Mm-hmm. Or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And we don't have that, right? We haven't had anything like that for a long time. But people don't want to, I think to some extent it's like a language transition, right? Where the switch just hasn't been flipped, right? Like you're trying to speak Spanish, but you hear in English first and then translate inside your head. But partly there are structures of the political economy, right? That the mobilizational apparatus feeds into, like jobs, what are called organizers, who are really more like technicians who can do bullhorns and campaigns and whatnot, right? Partly it's the fantasy land, right? That the sort of pious left lives in, like, but with the idea that you've got to bear witness, right? And the bearing witness becomes like a part of the politics. But it's clear, right, that and the Sanders campaign showed this too, and I think Bernie did as good a job as anybody could have done of trying to operate in the electoral realm. But it showed that we don't have an electoral constituency out there for our agenda, and we need to make it. And that's what we can spend the 4 years doing, right? Trying to organize. But what organizing means fundamentally is building a base and expanding it and consolidating it, and then building and expanding again. And that's all predicated on talking on the principle that you need to spend more time talking to people who don't already agree with you, right, than with the jerk-offs like on the internet. And that's the difficult pill, or the pill that people have a lot of trouble swallowing. I think there are political economic factors operating there too. I mean, that so many of visible left personalities are rooted in the culture industry and in the academy, where the career and opportunity structures impel more toward like individual branding than toward base building, right? And I mean, that's not the criticism of anybody in particular, but the political economic structures, right? Because you've noticed this, like I'm sure, I mean, how many people whom you encounter who represent themselves as activists define their activism by having started some kind of organization, right? Started like, if not an NGO, like was the founder of this, the founder of that, but the founder of the other. And it's all, it feels more and more like a Potemkin exercise that's directed toward like getting a shovel and a straw into the treasury of the Ford Foundation or in the equivalent.
Right.
So we need a different left, basically, a different way of thinking about the left. But there's always also like, and I'll shut up after this, but that, the cargo cult quality, right? Things are just fine now. Like this bullshit that's going on at the moment, whatever the moment is the thing that's going to emerge, right? Burst out into the mass movement that'll get us over the hump. And you don't understand because you're not close to it the way that I am. So you can't see it. But I can tell you that out off the coast, beyond the horizon, there's a ship that's bringing bountiful riches to us all and will emancipate us. And I mean, you can't argue with that kind of logic, right? I mean, the only thing you can say is because it's a logic that calls for faith in things as yet unseen. I've heard it about Black Lives Matter. I heard it about Occupy. I heard it about the Million Man March. So like the only argument you have against it is, well, I don't know. It's not exactly gravity, but every time something like this has like dropped the ball before, it's fallen down and not up. So why should I expect that this time is different? But the answer is some version of the faithful's conviction that this time is really different. So I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't care too much about talking to those people. Actually, I'd rather go talk to workers.
What do you think? I want to ask you about the Labor Party.
Okay.
But I also want to know what you think can be done about. I mean, it's funny because I'm always talking about how bad the Democrats are, obviously, and you know how close they are to the Republicans. And then every now and then I really step back and I look at something Trump is doing.
Right.
And it's not the Twitter stuff. And of course the Dems should be mad about the things that they're not. And the Russia, I mean, but like, how much do you think the discourse, the things that Trump says, the riling people up, how much do you think that actually really has an impact on conditions, behavior conditions? And what do you think how can that be combated? Well,
yeah, those are good questions. The first one, I don't know, right? I mean, I can't tell. I wonder the same thing. Sometimes when I'm feeling especially frustrated, it feels like a cynical dance, right? Where he pretends to outrage them and they pretend to be outraged, right? So that's one thing. I do think, right, like we've seen, I was talking to a buddy of mine in Atlantic City today, was telling me like there's another Trump flotilla out around Ocean City, right, out in the water. And like these are rich people, because there's no broke people out there in boats.
Right.
It's kind of cool that they were such self-centered idiots that they started sinking one another, which was kind of fun. But it's not so much Trump as that really shadowy, ugly underworld of ultra right wingers. I mean, neo-Nazis, or I don't even know what neo means in this case, right? But who, ironically and unfortunately, understand organizing, right? Much better than the posturing leftists do. So like they've got these various news services, and then there's shit like at the high end, Julius Krein, who has this new magazine called American Affairs. It's funny because he contacted me.
Oh, right, yeah.
Late in the spring about doing a book review. He was going to pay me $2,000 to do a book review. And being the person I am of my history, when I saw the name, I just assumed he was at least my age, was a Jewish neocon who was out someplace in Brooklyn with like a past that touched partisan review and right. And I mean that shit. And then I found out that he's the other kind of Julius Krein. He's from South Dakota. He's 18 years old,
right,
and is a Nazi basically. He went to Harvard, and was a Trumper until he wasn't. And this magazine is extremely well funded by Mellon or Scape or somebody like that. And they've been fishing, right? Because they've contacted several of my friends, and they got Angela Nagel, but she'd gotten got already anyway. Yeah. But they were trying to publish people with reputations for being iconoclasts on the left. And it's clearly like, it's clearly a political operation that's directed towards trying to stir up shit and discord right among leftists. So they've got the money to do that kind of thing. They've got the foresight and the organizational focus to do that sort of stuff. And like that's in addition to all those brown shirt types out there and the bogus news operations. Like I'm sure you've seen a million ads for the Epoch Times, I think they call it, right? It's just young, personable looking people, right? I mean, they know how to work that stuff. And my fear, and like this is back to the Labor Party connection, as Tony Mazzocchi used to say, like if we can't find something, we on our side can't find something credible to offer people who are suffering and who are going to be suffering more and more, that makes sense as an explanation of why they're suffering and that offers some plausible route out, then far more dangerous elements in society are going to do it. And we've defaulted on that. There's no question about that. And I also think, I had an argument like with Alex Coburn years and years ago about this. Like he had a period in the mid-90s when he was courting the militia movement, which was like the forerunner to these clowns out there now. And he thought that, we were like they were our natural brothers and so forth and so on. And I said to him, look, I can see what you're saying, but the fact is, like, this is the people who have bought into that have bought into a conspiratorial ideology and a community, right? And the thing about conspiratorial ideologies, like as Chip Burley said, that the absence of evidence is proof of the depth of the conspiracy. And it's an ontological commitment. Once somebody buys into it, you might be able to, win them over eventually. But it's like trying to drain the ocean with a teacup when the smarter focus is to try to connect with people before they succumb to the lure of that shit. And that takes us back again, to getting out of Brooklyn and trying to figure out how to talk to other people.
Yeah. That to me is like the Bernie model, which is, there's so much purity and condemning people who are maybe like not in the militia yet, but you could see them going there.
Yeah, right.
And we do have this idea. The irony is that the purity politics is like not fighting for, like not creating an alternative to that stuff. That's the purity politics because you're refusing to do anything to court people. And who's then going to be paying the price?
Right. No, that's a very important point. Yeah. And it is. And it just kind of, feeds back. And I know this is like a cheap way to look at it, or at least to talk about it. But it goes back to the fact that it's a dilettante's politics. It's a politics of people who are going to be okay no matter what happens, right? One way or another.
Yeah. It's funny. I remember. I want to read this comment. Thank you, Stephanie Welch. I've been reading and listening to Adolph Reed Jr. so much lately, and things get clearer to me every time. Thank you, Katie, for getting his voice out, especially now. Can't get enough of his viewpoints. Look at that.
Wow. Thank you, Stephanie Welch. I most appreciate it.
What were we just saying? That the dilettantes. Yeah. And it's also like, this is a particular thing that bothers me. This like white. It's like this performative white. Actually, the woman who's credentializing, I believe, is the term that Robin DiAngelo used, which is like a thing, but she doesn't realize that she does it too. Which is like when a white person is like showing off how woke they are.
Right.
But there is this thing where woke white people show how woke they are by condemning other like working class whites who aren't woke, right? And there's this guy Arish Singh who is a comedian. I've had him on the show, and he's Sikh and he wears a turban, and he was like, white people should not be like turning their backs on white working class people because we're the ones who face the fallout. Right. I'm paraphrasing, but it's like he's the one walking down the street who's going to be, not like the white person who decides to not talk to these people. Like, it's not on me. If you can't see why Trump is blah, 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 it's like, who do you think you're helping? Right.
No, exactly. And I tell you what, like, when September 11th happened, like my office was on 14th Street and 5th Avenue. And my apartment was on Avenue A between 14th and 13th. And once it was possible to walk down 13th Street to work, I'll tell you, like I got more treacherous looks and clutched handbags and grabbing cell phones than I've ever in my life. But I'll tell you what else too, about those white people who want to perform wokeness. And I was telling Touré that I'm committed to saying this whenever I'm interviewed now.
Your son. So people know.
That I've had it up past my eyeballs with the white people who try to explain to me that I don't understand the depth and the seriousness of the racism in the U.S. I mean, it's just it's like. How can you hold your mouth to say that, right? First of all, but if you want to, if it makes you feel better with your black friends, okay, fine. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's a politics that doesn't do anybody any good, right? And it's not going to help us get to anywhere we need to get to. And I mean. I can't remember if I've said this number yet. I mentioned it earlier today, but the 6.5 to 9 million people voted. For Trump. I did say it earlier, like for Trump, who voted for Obama. I mean, you got to explain that somehow, right? Just like I saw a douchebag who shall remain nameless for the moment, bragging on me in a pretty ugly way, speaking like of another one of the woke white fellows about Social Security stuff. And he kind of pushed this line again that 2/3 of the people, 2/3 of black workers were excluded from initial coverage under Social Security because they were agricultural workers and domestic workers. And this has been like the jumping off point for a New Deal so racist line.
Right,
but,
the New Deal so racist, yeah.
Touré Reed has pointed out a problem with that is that while 2/3 of black workers were excluded, almost 3/4 of all workers who were excluded under those provisions were white. So there's no question that Southern congressmen wanted to protect their planter class constituents, access to low-wage Black labor. They also wanted to protect their upper class constituents' access to low-wage white labor. And the growers in the West, right, also wanted to protect, their access to low-wage white or Latino labor. And frankly, the racial descriptor is the adjective. The low-wage labor is the noun, right? And I mean, that's what was most significant. So what does it do for us, right, to have people who are ostensibly progressives now? I mean, there used to be a phrase back in earlier phases of the communist movement, left in form, right in essence. And what kind of leftism is it that insists on attacking the New Deal, right? But universal programs across the board. I mean, this is a left that is not only in bed with, but is actively making babies with neoliberalism, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it doesn't mean, I've never understood that. It's like, okay, well, to the extent that, I mean, the New Deal was created then. No one's pretending that racism, as you said, the war on racism, I mean, no one's pretending there wasn't racism. So obviously things are going to be reflected in that.
Right.
It's like the fact that, I mean, no one says about Obama's like Lilly Ledbetter thing, which made it easier for women basically to sue for harassment or discrimination. No one's like, well, is that going to end sexism? No, everyone saw it as a good thing.
Right.
Yeah, it's I don't really know if people seem to think it's a really smart thing to observe, but as you said, they're not even actually being precise about the types of discrimination and disenfranchisement that went on with the New Deal. But why wouldn't you just say that, like, and this is what we need to fight for and make it that much more inclusive as opposed to like throwing it away? Well,
see, this is one thing I think that happened, and it also connects with, and I really don't mean to make all this about me, but it also connects, with another line that has been brought to my attention off and on, that I used to be anti-racist, but I'm not anymore. And what happened was in the late 80s, right, as Clintonism was taking over in the Democratic Party, and this is also ironic for Joy Reid and all those assholes, that the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party was making its bones by attacking poor people and poor Black people in particular. And there was a line coming out of Clinton-connected intellectuals, and the early American Prospect was guilty of this. Paul Starr even wrote an article in which he yearned for going back to 1940, like before race was an issue in American politics, which is what he said. He said, well, I don't know, you think race wasn't an issue for it in 1940. But it probably was for everybody I know who was alive in 1940. So there was a group of scholars. Fran Piven was one of them, Michael K. Brown at Santa Cruz, Joe Guadagno at Florida State, I think. And others, right? I mean, I was one of them, who tried to respond to the romanticized version of New Deal universal programs that the Clinton people were nostalgic for, because they didn't really mean expansion of a social democratic state, right? I mean, they meant stuff like the earned income tax credit, basically, right? Which Matt Greening, I think, just did a great takedown on too. That I'd suggest read. Yeah, but he's a great guy.
Yeah,
but so that cohort of scholars, and these people are all academics, just about late 80s, early 90s. In fact, Julian Bond and I co-edited a special issue of The Nation, which is what eventually became Without Justice for All. Taking it to this line, people like Thomas Edsall, that the iteration of Theta Scotchpole, and a variety of others. So then what happens is like a younger cohort of scholars sort of picks up on this critique of the complexity, like, of the New Deal, right? And where we've been arguing that yeah, like we need universal programs that are truly universal this time around, right? And are redistributive. A subsequent group of scholars, I don't know if it's like the telephone game or, trying to establish their own turf.
Their beat, yeah.
Would take the next step. And it's not like they define themselves as going beyond us, right? So I'm not suggesting that. I mean, but I guess they imagine themselves taking the next step to show that, well, actually, the New Deal was more thoroughly racist, and racism is like, original sin, and so forth and so on. It's also the case that that there aren't a lot of jobs in fancy academic places for people with Marxist politics, right? There was like a little moment, right? I mean, back there, I mean, obviously I'm an illustration of it, when fortuitously, right, somebody could fall into a gig someplace fancy, but those days are long gone, and the safe academic path now, because this is the hegemonic path, is what a friend of mine who insists that I not give him credit, has described as McWokeism, is like the dominant ideology, which reminds me of something else I wanted to mention, and I suspected that we get to this eventually. But the Jessica Krug thing.
Oh yeah.
And I saw that there was another woman who has just been outed, a grad student at the University of Wisconsin, and she's done her version of the confession before the Soviet tribunal. But I was joking. Like I made an oblique reference to this in the piece that I did in Common Dreams on the Dolezal case, but there's a disjunction between the McWokeite insistence that nothing has changed since 1865 or 1619 or whatever, and the reality was that you could not have found anybody, right, in 1920, right, or 1960, probably not 1970, probably not even 1980, maybe, but except for an affirmative action thing, who would seek to represent themselves as Black to gain career advantage or street cred, right? So they got some splaining to do on that one. But I don't know. I mean, Krug's got her problems, and again, like my son just did a piece on this in a short piece on her case in Jacobin, and he made the point that what's most revealing about her is the minstrel images that she took up, right? What she thought she could sell or wanted to be, right? Whatever, is like a minstrel image, and if that's what's marketable, and Lord knows, I've seen certifiably Black people pimp this kind of thing too for a long time. A performance of authenticity when there's really no such thing as racial authenticity in the first place. But I will say though, like in fairness, I mean, the Dolezal, she just, whatever her problems were, she was trying to do good. Whatever this woman's problems are, her behavior came with a really tawdry performance and more than a hint of careerism.
Yeah. No, Dolezal, apparently people were saying that like when she got busted, the NAACP really took a hit because she was doing a lot of good organizing, which is like.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, and as I pointed out in my essay at the time, I mean, people were making up lies basically to make it easier to attack her because they wanted her to have been guilty of things that they imagined. And what a lot of those charges were, or rather, a lot of those charges were also quite revealing on their own terms, right? Like,
ooh, I never saw this piece. I have to read it and then have you on again.
Oh yeah, well, we have
Dolezal piece, yeah.
It's not a fun piece, right? I think you'll have a good time with it. Because the bottom line is, I said, okay, well, we either accept Dolezal or we don't accept Jenner. And the logic is such that it's got to go that way. You either accept them both or you accept neither. And then what's the argument then for insisting that one is a legitimate but the other one isn't? And the only arguments that I saw, and this is what prompted me to write the piece. In fact, like I emailed Quealy on a Saturday night and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Would you be
yeah, the editor. John. Yeah.
And I got up on Sunday morning and had an email from him that said yes. And I just sat down at the kitchen table and wrote it, or the couch, and wrote it over the course of 15 hours in a white heat. But one of the things that prompted me to do it was that the response to the, how do you justify one and not the other, was never anything more elaborate than she's not black. And
right.
Well, according to what criteria? And so, well, because I said so. Well, I said, no, that's not good enough. Right. But anyway.
That's so funny you brought that up, because I actually just brought that up with someone, and I said, the only response I ever heard was like, how dare you? And I didn't even make this argument publicly. I saw people making it, and people who I consider very brave would not make this argument. They told me that they wouldn't. But there was someone who made this argument in Hapisha, do you remember an academic wrote something, right?
And like, she was brave. I mean, somebody said,
and she got thrown under the bus, like, because
this woman was an assistant professor at Rhodes College, I think, in Memphis, and she's a philosophy professor, and she published the article in Hypatia.
Yeah, right.
And the journal moused out, basically, and retracted the article. I understand that they subsequently reinstated it, but it was horrible. And like, she was correct, right? She was correct. But I mean, I just saw. I was going to say.
Yeah, it was Rhodes College in Memphis. Yeah, where she basically asked why it was called In Defense of Transracialism. Yeah, right, and they threw her under all these editors. Somehow it's really
it's horrible and chicken shit.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, like, you could make a very good case for why they're different. I mean, I haven't heard it, but you could certainly make it without saying that someone has to not even publish something. But again, it's like the sacred cows. And I feel like a reactionary saying this, but like, I haven't heard anyone actually explain why. And I'm not saying they are parallel. They're interchangeable. They're the same thing. I just haven't heard anyone say, this is why a transracial identity is inherently problematic and a transgender one is inherently not problematic.
Right. Well, and that's why I wrote the piece, because I've been reading stuff kind of voraciously for a week and a half, and there was never anything more than fiat.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, well, at a minimum, like, this will this might prod people to try to come correct about this. But I will say this too, and this is something else for the record, some number of people out there, I don't know how many, have got it in their heads that this piece exposed me as a transphobe.
Right.
And I think the only clear allegation that I've seen, and I saw this not that long ago, was that I referred to Caitlyn Jenner as Bruce when Bruce was Bruce, and referred to Caitlyn as Caitlyn when Caitlyn was Caitlyn. And I also said that the most significant identity of Jenner to me was her the Republicanism. And since she was a Republican when she was Bruce and a Republican when she was Caitlyn, I was just going to refer to her as Republican Jenner.
Yeah.
And I think that pissed some people off too. But, you know, I mean, we've talked about this all night, I guess. I mean, read tendentiously or they don't read, right?
Right.
They impose their will on texts. But
another shout out from Raphael. Thank you. Been a really illuminating show. Thanks, Raphael.
Oh yeah, thank you, Raphael.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is interesting. Well, someone's saying Rachel is given plenty of chances to apologize, but okay, there's we'll have to have another show because I have to read up on this. Not like I'm not gonna. That sounds like I'm judging someone. I have to read it. I'm excited to read it.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Anyone have any questions? Thank you so much for your time, by the way.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
If anyone has any questions,
for me.
What'd you say?
I said it's an hour earlier for me.
Oh, where are you?
I'm in New Orleans.
Isn't that? I'm in New York City. I'm so stupid. That's different there. Is
Yeah.
it always different?
Yeah.
I'm so embarrassed. I had no idea. I always thought New Orleans was the same.
No.
Wow.
Atlanta.
Okay, that's yeah. Well, any final thoughts for Dr. Reed? I didn't realize it's Central Time. Yeah. Let's see. There are a lot of comments up earlier. Let's see. Where are they? Does Professor Reed believe class dynamics applies to Native Americans, or was the intent of cultural eradication? Crap. Where'd that go? Bent on militaristic white supremacy, being they weren't intended to participate in labor. Here, I'll put that up there.
Oh, okay. Well, I think this. I mean, that Native Americans. Well, Native Americans were the victims, like, of empire building, right? And empire building is fundamentally a class project, right? And people kind of lose sight of the fact that, a friend of mine just said this morning that white supremacy, I think a way to look at the relationship between white supremacy and capitalism is that white supremacy has been at different points the scaffolding that helps to solidify the building, or helps to hold up the building while it's being constructed, right? And once the building is solid and sturdy, you don't need the scaffolding anymore, right? And like this came up in discussion of how much the public recognition, public historical commemoration has changed in Charleston, South Carolina, since I first started going down there to visit, like in the late 70s. I mean, I remember the first time I ever went to Charleston. The placard on the house where John Calhoun wrote the nullification ordinance was bubbly, right? I mean, this is where he wrote it. Next time I'm down there, like in the late 80s, or no, probably early 90s. The language is moderated a little bit. And by the time we started working down there at the end of the 90s, it was all multiculti. And the city, about a year ago, made a big to-do of erecting an historical marker on the Battery to Robert Charles, the slave ship's pilot who stole a ship and sailed like 40 some slaves to freedom behind Union lines, and that never would have been thinkable in the late 1970s or 1980s. And the crescendo of this, like in Charleston, was a few weeks ago, month or two ago, whatever. Pandemic time, just all
yeah, no, it's all flattened. Yeah.
Yeah, but they took there's this massive pedestal or a big sculpture of John C. Calhoun on a massive pedestal in the heart of downtown. It was quite like the Robert E. Lee statue here. And the city took it down. And the city took it down without cavil. There was no beef or anything. That would have been absolutely unthinkable in 1990. And the class relations haven't changed. And that means, from a superficial glance, right, like the apportionment of goods and bads in the local polity along race lines, at first glance, doesn't look like it's changed that much, right? I mean, most of the conspicuously poor people are Black. Most of the conspicuously rich people are white. But they have changed, right? I mean, the class dynamics, because you know what? Turns out you don't really need white supremacy for the ruling class to do what it wants to do, right? It was a useful thing. Like, I mean, just keeping it Charleston for a minute. Like in late 1840s and 1850s. There's a great book on this by Johnson and Rourke, which I know sounds like a cooking school, but it's called Black Masters. It's a study of several generations of a Black slave-owning family in South Carolina. And they detail, and these guys aren't ideologues. I mean, they're good historians, but they show how, like into the 1840s, there was a significant free Black population in Charleston who were mainly craftsmen. And there was a substantial population of skilled slave workers, and more of West Indian model, the owners had worked out arrangements with the skilled slaves that they could sell off some of their labor to others in exchange for the master getting a cut of the proceeds, right? By the end of the 1840s, when two things happened. One was that the white immigrant population grew. And the other, the more consequential one, because until that point, the planter class showed a decided preference for free Black artisan labor, which tended to be higher skilled, and also for slave craftsmen than for busted white workers, basically, right, who were just considered, I don't know, trash. But starting over the 1850s, as it became clearer to the local planter class that secession was likely to become an issue, right? Their response to free white workers began to shift, and they began to emphasize their shared whiteness with these white workers, and it showed up in labor regulation, so that the pendulum swung toward reducing the competition from free Black and skilled slave workers, right? But it's driven by a political imperative. It's not driven, and yeah, like I'm sure, all these guys are committed to white supremacy as an ideology and believed it, because one of the things that ideologies, my dad always pointed out, is like a mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you like to think you believe in with what advances your material interests. But white supremacy was functional, right, for material objectives. Fast forward to the end of the 19th century and the defeat of the populist movement, you see the same thing, but even more aggressively, right, to an extent that white supremacy was in some ways imposed on white workers and and farmers, as almost as much as it was on blacks, but in different ways with different consequences, obviously. So going back to like the Native American question, yeah, I mean, white supremacy emerges out of the conquest, right? But the point of the conquest is expansion of capitalism, right? So I think you asked what time it is. I told you how to make a watch, but
that's good. Yeah. Two more questions. One is Brian Frederick asks thoughts on Trump's Hispanic support. And then I have a question for you to comment on something, but okay. We can go with that one first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, right? I mean, like we'll see how people actually vote, and that's one thing. I will say this though, that Hispanic has always been like a funny category, right? I mean, even funnier than Black or African American. Well, it's probably not any funnier than African American, which came into common usage at the very moment where there was, for the first time in history of the Republic, a genuinely voluntary immigration of people to America from Africa who you think might have been African Americans, but oh well.
Right.
And we owe that one to Jesse Jackson. But as I assume you know, the questioner, it's a category that encompasses a hell of a lot of different people from different places, with different trajectories and backgrounds, right? So like Kimberly Guilfoyle didn't even know that Puerto Ricans were citizens of the United States, and her mama was one. So what does that tell you? Latino identity was kind of, and this is not to say it's bogus, but was partly a project invented or taken up by LULAC, and I forget what it stands for now. But it's a political organization that dates back from before World War II, I believe. And its objective was to build a political bloc, right, that would be a significant player like in interest group politics. So you take Bolivians and Cubans and Puerto Ricans and all kinds of other people, Panamanians, and call them by one thing because they more or less speak the same language. But I'm sure you know too, like, politically, politics among Mexican Americans varies depending on, thank you, whether you're in Chicago, Texas, California, Colorado. Puerto Rican politics, like on the East Coast, is in the Northeast is like different from Puerto Rican politics, like in Chicago, and Cuban politics. I mean, what can I say?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, like we'll see. I mean, I was talking to somebody earlier today who raised the question about whether Trump would be able to appeal to values voters, right, among Hispanics. Well, yeah, see, Florida. Well, yeah, Florida. I mean, that's where, like in addition to my family, that's where the right-wing Cubans are.
Yeah.
So that's what you expect. And like that's a politics that has a particular history that frankly has as much to do with Florida as it has to do with Cuba, right? So I don't know, we'll see.
And then let's see, I wanted to show you this. I think I don't remember if we talked about this, but this really interesting article that was let's see, I tweeted about it. I'm not asking you to comment on my choice words, but okay. This is where I can find it.
Yeah. Yeah, that thing.
It's just so ridiculous. So
I read your tweet too. Yeah.
So this was an article, Purity Test, Democrats clash over Biden diversity goals. The debate over whether corporate insiders should be in the mix for cabinet positions is shaping up to be a major point of tension within the party. Black Democrats are urging Joe Biden to resist growing pressure from the left to impose an anti-Wall Street purity test on his hiring decisions if elected, warning that it threatens the party's desire to boost diversity in powerful executive branch posts.
It's
which
amazing.
is, yeah.
To the extent that that's true, right? And not just a reality that Politico wants to call into existence. And I don't doubt that it's true. I mean, to the extent that it is, though, that just goes back to what I've been saying about Joe and Reed and that crew, right? And that's yet another reason that Walter and I, and we aren't alone in this either, have been saying that the race politics versus class politics is a mischaracterization, not least because what is understood to be anti-racist politics at this point is fundamentally a class politics, but a class politics, but a politics that reflects the class interests of POCs who would be most likely to benefit from attacks on disparity.
Right. And it says, let's see, progressives have been calling on Biden to take a hard line in filling out his cabinet with groups such as Justice Democrats and Sunrise Movement, demanding that he pledge to appoint 0 current or former Wall Street executives or corporate lobbyists to administration. Right. But Black Democrats on Capitol Hill on K Street say that's in direct conflict with the party's overarching diversity goals and would keep many people of color, including those with ties to the financial world, from ascending to key positions long dominated by white males. And then, of course, we go to Representative Gregory Meeks, one of the most corrupt members of Congress. We've got to fix all of the problems that were created over the last 4 years. We're going to need every hand on deck.
Right.
And then,
that's amazing, right? I mean, I wish that article had come out when we published ours on Non-Site, because that just says it all.
Yeah, you almost can't make it up. It's like 2 on the nose, And then there's this discourse of we don't have the luxury of, which is like, we don't have the luxury of
standing for anything. Right. Like not standing for anything is paid off so well. Right. I mean, that's just. But I mean, this is like something that I'm arguing in this book too. That it's always, now is not the time. Right. The Republican candidate will be the end of Western civilization. Pardon me, the end of Western civilization, and it's also the case. I mean, that they've been, since Bill Clinton, they've been running to appeal to to the same constituency under different names. Like in 2016, Eastern Pennsylvania, we were a swing state. So we got Clinton ads like all day and all night. And they just ran 2 ads. One was this woman who's an econ professor at Drew, who says, I'm a Republican. And she gives off all the signals of mainline sobriety, right? The haircut, the dress, all of it. And she says, I'm a Republican, but my son has autism, and there's no place for my son in Donald Trump's world. And the other one was the grab him by the pussy ad. And I thought, really, you think this is what's going to win Pennsylvania for you? But it's that same constituency, like in 2004, which was the first election I was in Philly for. It was like the New York Times even did like a feature on a little bullshit borough that I live in, that was about the Democrats trying to appeal to what they call then national security moms. But, it's like different versions of this constituency that's fiscally conservative, socially liberal. They kind of like war, as not as it's as long as it's not too bloody at home.
Right.
And that constituency is something that consultants made up, like it doesn't exist, and the Democrats never win it. Right. But that begs the question, why that's what they keep going for. Because it's not like they're stupid. It's not like they're deranged. And I think the answer is that's the economic constituency that they
Yeah.
want to appeal to.
Yeah.
And they want to bullshit the rest of us and say, like, this is the core constituency, constituency
Right.
for us.
Pretending it's pragmatic and not ideological.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right.
I gotta have you and Thomas Frank on at the same time.
That'd
be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I haven't seen Tom.
Yeah, his latest book is on anti-populism.
Right. Yeah.
History of anti-populism. Yeah.
Take a look at it.
Yeah. Well, this was amazing, and thank you so much. And I'd love to have you on again. And I want to have Touré on.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah.
Oh, do you have his email? I can send it.
No, I'll email it to you. Yeah. I mean, I'll email you. You can send it to me. Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you again so much.
Yep.
Dr. Adolph Reed, everyone, thank you. Really honored that you spent so much time with us.
Hey, that's fun. Thank you.
Yeah. And what's your, I was very abrupt because I felt bad you've been on so long, but what's your next book on?
Well, the book that I'm trying to finish is one that I started with Verso right after Obama was elected, and it's been completely redefined and reorganized. The title of it now is When Compromises Come Home to Roost, the Decline and Transformation of the U.S. Left. And I've got one more chapter to finish. I'm hoping to get done before the end of the calendar year. You will hear the shout when I finish it, no matter where I am.
Oh, great. Awesome. Okay. I'll
All right,
stay
thanks a
on
lot,
to
Katie.
talk to you. Thanks, Adolph.
Yep.
Thank
Take
you very
care.
much.